Hey scholars, so today we're going to start a new unit. This is going to be lesson 6.1, Intro to Medieval Europe. For your do now today, you're going to use the map to select the names of the continents where we've been spending most of our time studying in social studies this year. So feel free to pause your video at this time and complete your do now. So the three continents that we've primarily been studying are Asia, Africa, and Europe. For this next unit, we're primarily going to be focusing on Europe. Our final unit will take us through the beginning of the post-classical era, or the medieval period. At this point in history, Europe is considered a backwater or underdeveloped land in the medieval period, but it burst into a more developed world at the end of the medieval period. And as we progress through Unit 6, you'll see how all these other empires, land, and global patterns that we've studied over the course of the year will intersect with Europe's story. And you'll be more able to analyze the role and significance of the empires we've studied in the past as we go through this last unit. So now that we know where we are in our study, the continent of Europe specifically, we need to know when in history we are. So for this study, we're actually finished now with our classical era. So that moves us into this time between 500 to 1300 CE. So this time frame between 500 and 1300 CE is the medieval period or the post-classical period. Remember, post as a prefix simply means after. So we're finished up with the classical period, so we're in the post-classical. All right. After the medieval period, which is this era we'll be studying, you have the early modern period, which goes from 1300 to 1700 CE. So we're getting pretty close to our more modern times, especially compared to where we started. If you recall, we started with the Neolithic Revolution at about 10,000 BCE, and we've gone all the way through history, and right now we're around 500. So we've made a lot of progress over the course of this year. And we've seen a lot of changes, particularly when it comes to the Roman Empire. So I want you to take a look at the two maps on your screen. The one on the left shows a split between the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire at around 300 CE. That should be pretty familiar to you at this point, as we've studied it pretty extensively. If you take a look over to the map on the right, you'll see something that looks quite different, right? Of course, you don't see that same part of the Eastern Roman Empire because we're more so focused on the West. So what I want you to jot down on your worksheet is what happened between these 300 years. You see something very, very specific that changes in the Western Roman Empire. So go ahead and pause your video at this time and answer your question. All right, and you should have a little something like this. Doesn't have to be too fancy. Really, we just need to know that the Roman Empire is over. Like, it's just done. And Europe is fractured or broken up into many smaller kingdoms. So what ultimately causes this is Rome falls and is captured by the Visigoth hordes in 476 CE. The stability that Europe had seen under the unified and more militant Roman leadership completely vanishes at this point. The entire continent is left without protection or clear leaders, and for most of the medieval period, Europe was subject to warring armies trying to establish leadership, and you also have attacks and raids of northern tribes, particularly the Germanic tribes or the Norse, something you'll know as Viking tribes. So for our DBQ today, we're going to be trying to answer the question, what were the conditions of Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire? So we know that Rome fell. We talked about it for so very long last unit, but we also know that it's because of this Visigoth invasion and takeover that we really see it just completely shut down to an irreparable place. So I want you to keep this question in mind as we go through your documents, and we'll revisit it at the end of the lesson. Right, document A. This is an account of the siege of Paris by Vikings, also known as the Northmen, in 885 CE by Abbo Cernus. The author was a French monk who may have written this account at the request of the French king, but scholars aren't 100% sure. Let's take a look at the text. The Northmen, Danish Vikings, came to Paris with 700 sailing ships. In the morning, the Northmen, boarding their ships, approached the tower of Paris and attacked it. They shook it with their engines and stormed it with arrows. The city resounded with clamor, loud sounds. The bridges trembled. All came together to defend the tower. There perished many Franks, or Frenchmen. The tower had been sorely tired, but its foundations were still solid. The people spent the night repairing it with boards. By the next day, a new tower was built, a half higher than the former one. At sunrise, the Northmen caught their first glimpse of it. Once more, the latter engaged with the Christians in violent combat. On every side, arrows sped and blood flowed. The arrows mingled with the stones hurled by slings and war machines. The air was filled with them. The city shook with the struggle. So, with this text, we get a very vivid picture of what's happening in the city of Paris. We have these Danish Vikings coming in and attacking the French, right? When you see the phrase Norman, right, that's just the shortened phrase for Northmen, right? And I want you to consider, what had these Normans or Northmen been able to do in document A? So go ahead and answer your quick multiple choice question and create your central idea. So before we revisit our DBQ, I wanted to give you a little bit more historical context for what Western Europe is like during the Middle Ages. Let's take a look. For 500 years, much of Europe was part of the Roman Empire. The rest of the continent was controlled by groups of people that the Romans called barbarians. When Rome fell to invading barbarians in 476 CE, Europe was left with no central government or system of defense. Many invading groups set up kingdoms throughout Western Europe. These kingdoms were often at war with one another. The most powerful rulers were those who controlled the most land and had the best warriors. A need for order and protection. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Western Europe was threatened by three main groups. Muslims, or followers of the religion of Islam, advanced from the Near East and northern Africa into what is now Spain. Magyars, a Central Asian people, pressed in from the east, and Vikings swept down from present-day Norway and Denmark. The Vikings were fierce warriors who struck fear into the people of Europe. At times, their intent was to set up colonies, but they were best known for their terrifying raids on towns and villages. Imagine a Viking attack. The people of the village are at early morning church services when an alarm bell starts to peal. Vikings, long, shallow wooden boats, have brought the Vikings close to shore. Now they leave their boats and run toward the town with swords and axes raised over their heads. People are running in all directions. Several villagers who try to resist are killed. Others are seized by the Viking raiders and taken back to ships. Clearly, the people of Western Europe needed ways to defend themselves. To protect themselves and their property, they gradually developed a system we call feudalism. Let's find out how it worked. And we'll talk more about that in the next lesson. But let's take a look at what we've really learned today. Again, our DBQ is, what were the conditions of Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire? And really, the conditions in medieval Europe were chaotic and disordered as raiding, invasions, and wars for power were common. Abbo Cernus wrote an account of Paris being attacked and raided. Monasteries were often the site of learning and education in medieval Europe. Cernus is a member of the small educated population, which is why he was the one to document the attack in writing. According to Abbo Cernus, the Northmen attacked Paris with great force, killing many of the Franks and destroying their military resources. Europe was chaotic and filled with war, particularly from outside raiders who came to steal and plunder resources. In England, wars for power also created disorder. According to William of Malmesbury, the Normans, who had come to rule France, continued to wage war of expansions and eventually defeated the Anglo-Saxons of England by killing their king, Harold. As a historian born after the Battle of Hastings, Malmesbury likely used other accounts to craft his narrative, and opinions about the Norman conquest could have been present in the accounts he used. Europe was truly suffering from frequent wars as leaders fought over power and also fended off attacks from raiding tribes. We've seen a ton of change and a ton of difficulty and hardship in Western Europe between the early stages of the fall of Rome up into this point in around 500 CE. So we'll continue learning about feudalism in our next lesson and go a little bit deeper into that. But at this time, go ahead and complete your worksheet. And once you feel comfortable, go ahead over to your exit ticket. If you do have any questions, we can take care of those during our Zoom meeting. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and I'll see you soon.